how to analyze if crowdsourcing is right for your project today. And as we get started, our world is governed by rules like gravity. Similarly, there's processes to the world that we live in that once you understand how some of these processes work, they can save your life. Process, for example, like driving a car. There's a gas and a brake pedal. If you don't know how to operate a gas and a brake pedal, don't drive a car. Similarly, there are processes to crowdsourcing that if you understand how crowdsourcing works at a fundamental level, it's going to help you just make life a whole lot easier. So, what we're going to talk about today is the engine behind crowdsourcing and how that's going to help us, and we'll kind of flow through this. So, if you think about crowdsourcing as an engine, one of the first most technical components of crowdsourcing is the crowd. Crowdsourcing is defined as an idea or a task, a challenge that I put out to an undefined public. Now this can be done online, offline, but for the sake of this talk, we're going to focus pretty much just at the online world. So if the crowd is the first component of this engine or cycle, how do you make someone make a conscious decision to participate with you? Well, first you have to get their attention. This is YouTube. I hope you're familiar with YouTube. YouTube is one of the most amazing crowdsource environments on all the planet. They do such an incredible job. And so if crowd is the first component of crowdsourcing, attention or awareness is really that second component. And so you need to get their awareness, their attention, in order to fuel that which matters most, which is their desire to participate with you. And if you think about it, this is an example of a cover of a song called Somebody That I Used to Know by a band called Godier. This was done by a group called Walk Off the Earth. And interestingly enough, they're a crowdsource group. 5 individuals play a single song on one guitar. It's a lot of fun to watch. But they wanted to get attention for what they did. And their reward was 143 million views. And the thing that I find fascinating about this is those 143 million views also help out Godier at the end of the day. Because if you see the cover of the song, you're probably going to want to see the original. So if you think about Godier, when they were starting to make this song, Somebody That I Used to Know, do you think they asked themselves the question, I really want to make the best crowdsource covered song on all of YouTube? Probably not. But what if they had? So let's look at this cycle. You got the crowd. The crowd shines the light on the awareness, which fuels the desire, which fundamentally attracts more people to the crowd. It's a virtuous cycle. And this is something that any company, any organization can use to nurture their own cycle of crowd-accelerated innovation. So we'll be coming back to this again and again, but just think through this cycle as we move forward. You get the crowd, dial up the awareness, get the desire, attract more people to the crowd. Up here is a list of over 200 companies that use crowdsourcing as a primary, even secondary mechanism to the way that they do business. You'll find there's really 8 buckets here: crowdfunding, tools, cloud labor, civic engagement, collective knowledge, collective creativity, community building, open innovation. And this is just even scratching the surface at the possibility of what crowdsourcing really can bring to the table and what it can do to help you in your business, maybe in your project. So as you think about how can I use crowdsourcing, know that there's a lot of other people, just like how Stephen described earlier, doing things similarly that you can kind of take a look at and see how you can start to build upon that. So now that we know what crowdsourcing is, I think it's also important to understand what crowdsourcing is not. First of all, crowdsourcing is not outsourcing. Similar to outsourcing, they are both putting out a set of tasks, challenges, or problems to a select group of people. But the difference is when you crowdsource, you are sending out a task or problem to an undefined public that has to choose to participate with you, versus if you're outsourcing, you're putting out a task or a problem to a defined public that is chosen by you or chosen by your organization. It's a very key differentiator, but it's something that's super important. And with that, there are 3 distinct advantages to crowdsourcing. First and foremost, it's pretty cheap. You can do crowdsourcing relatively inexpensively, if not free, by being able to get the desire of the crowd that you're working with involved. Second, it's a great marketing tool. It doesn't matter how many Super Bowl ads you put in front of me. It doesn't matter if I'm listening to the radio or watching TV, seeing a digital ad, seeing something written in print. Nothing is as powerful as a friend of mine coming up to me and saying, hey, I got this idea, or I saw this thing online, or hey, you should check out these shoes. I like shoes. So if I think about that, these are 3 distinct advantages of crowdsourcing. But with that, there's also the disadvantages. There are 3 distinct disadvantages behind crowdsourcing. First, ownership rights. What do I mean by ownership rights? Well, you are sending out a task or problem to an undefined public. Who knows where they got their stuff from? They could be just coming to you saying, I made this song, or I made this movie, or I made this piece of software. How can you trust them? You really can't. So you need to weigh that risk going into it. YouTube faces this all the time. I can't tell you how many times somebody will put up a video or a movie or a song and say they wrote it, when that's not the case. And so ownership rights is a big downside to crowdsourcing, but it's a weighted risk. The second one is ideas are open. If you put something out there, guaranteed, if you're doing anything crowdsourcing, your competition is going to be able to see it. That's important. If I want to do something that might be a little bit more on the secretive side, be aware of it. Which leads me to the third downside of crowdsourcing, which is crowdsourcing the wrong thing. What do I mean by crowdsourcing the wrong thing? Well, for those of you that have done this, I mean no condemnation. I have done it, so learn from my mistakes. Don't crowdsource research and development. If you're trying to do research and development, trying to make something absolutely unique out in the market, it's an open environment. Once you put it out there, anybody can see it. So if you crowdsource something wrong, not necessarily saying research and development is wrong, you can do that right, but it is a risk that you take. If you put out something out there that you want to crowdsource and it ends up being the wrong thing, it can end up having an adverse effect rather than a positive. Crowdsourcing is not throwing out an open-ended problem. If I throw out an open-ended problem and I hope for some great solution, it's called a contest. And a contest is not crowdsourcing. When I think about crowdsourcing, I want to think back to that virtuous cycle. The crowd brings the awareness, which fuels desire, which draws more back into the crowd. If you haven't heard of Kickstarter, it is an incredible crowdfunding, crowdsource platform. Anybody with an idea can go to it. Once you're on the site, you can put an idea up and solicit to the community to fund your project. This one in particular actually was a project that I worked on with some friends called People in Motion. It's a film about free running, otherwise known as parkour. And it's a lot of fun to do. But this one had a definitive start, middle, and end. It had a start. I had an idea. I needed funding. I didn't have traditional means of funding. I want to go find a way to get that funding. Kickstarter was a way that I could solicit to a community to ask for that funding, which was awesome. So I put the idea up online. That's the crowd. It had a middle. I needed to raise awareness that I was doing this project. And I needed to get people involved, right? Because there's thousands, if not tens of thousands of other Kickstarters on the web right now that are fighting for that share of someone's dollar. That is the awareness. Then I had to have an end to my role. I had a set level of funding. I needed $7,000 to do this. So I needed to get that amount of money. How am I going to get that amount of money? Well, I had to offer something that would ignite someone's desire, to give me that dollar. And so we offered incentives and rewards as part of our Kickstarter initiative in order to participate. About $1, $5, $10, $15, $20, $100 would get you X. Crowdsourcing is not closed. When you think of crowdsourcing, I want you to think of openness. They go hand in hand. We're a social species, and we spark off of one another. And so when you put something out to the crowd, you want your participants to be as diverse as possible, because that's going to inspire groupthink. Groupthink is when people come together and solve challenges bigger than they can solve on their own. If you ever heard the old adage, the sum is greater than the parts, it applies so true to crowdsourcing. So now that we know what crowdsourcing is, know what crowdsourcing isn't, say we have some ideas on how we can start to implement crowdsourcing into our projects. Comes stress testing, poking holes, because this is going to help us understand whether or not our idea is going to sink or swim in the real world. One of the first things is to ask the right questions. You're like, duh. But when I think of asking the right questions, some of the stuff I ask is, did I define the problem fully? You know, I put something out into the community. If I didn't define the problem fully, people are going to start to ask questions back to me. And as we all know, every single person in this room is different. Granted, every single person in the community is going to be different. They're all going to have a different interpretation. Second question I ask is, have I given enough openness to the amount of people that I want to participate to give me sufficient input? And what I mean by that is, do I have a big enough crowd? It's really important to think about how big your crowd is, because the likelihood of having 100% of your population involved in your project is pretty low. So if I think about it like, if I have my crowd, that's my total population, a subset of that crowd will be aware that my project even exists. An even smaller subset of that population will be incentivized to want to participate. At the end of the day, my crowd might be a lot smaller than I thought it was. Something to think about me. The third thing that I focus on when I ask the right questions is did I give them enough time? There is certain worlds that we exist in when we see crowdsourced environments where there's an artificial time limit set. Kickstarter is a great example of that. It helps define the start, middle, and end. But if you set a definitive time that is too soon until you hit that critical mass of awareness in your crowd, you might not achieve the result that you're looking for. And so giving your crowd enough time to participate is important. But you don't want to give them too much time because they may get bored, they may move on to something else. So it's kind of like these levers that we play with. It's good things to think about as we go through this project. I want you guys to redefine your thinking of original. Nothing is original. Ideas, they're just recycled upon and innovated upon over and over again. Who here's got an iPhone? Raise your hand if you got an iPhone. With those hands raised, so, who here thinks an iPhone is just an original piece of technology? I thought so too. But then again, phones, MP3 players, day planners, they existed long before iPhone. But Apple was one of the first ones to put it together in a smart, sexy little package. But then you're like, no, that's not fair. What about airplanes? Airplanes are original. They didn't exist 100 years ago, 200 years ago. But then again, birds were flying 200 million years before we were. So where do we get these ideas? Well, they come from somewhere. But the question is not how do I make something original for original's sake, but rather how do I make something original as it relates to me, my company, and what I'm trying to accomplish. When you think of YouTube, they get 1 billion videos uploaded every month. How is it that people are still paying attention? And once you get bored, I've seen one video, I've seen them all. It's not quite the case. It's because people putting up videos on YouTube, they understand that what I'm putting up there is an expression of me as it relates to my environment and my personality, what is going on in the world, right here and now, and it creates this level of engagement that's fun and fun to be a part of. It makes it feel, in effect, original. So if we think about how we can be more original, coming back to this cycle of crowdsourcing, there's ways that we can dial up and dial down each one of these. You think of the crowd. Do I need to make my crowd bigger or smaller? I can make it bigger by just saying, hey, you know, my target audience is 25-year-old males in the New York area. That's going to give you probably a lot of males, right? But I could make my crowd bigger by just saying, hey, I want 25-year-old male and females of any given audience. Automatically, I've now doubled my sample size. You could say, hey, you know, I also want to include Twitter or include Tumblr in these communities. Now I've opened my crowd to larger levels. Now I have more people to participate with. I could dial up light or awareness, kind of when we go back and forth on, but light or awareness. And the way that I can dial that up is by, you know, doing search engine optimization, SEM. I can do PR, social media campaigns, things to get me and make sure that people who are in my crowd are more in tune with what it is that I'm doing. Finally, I could dial up desire. Now it's just a matter of, how do I incentivize someone to participate despite circumstances? Easiest way to think of that is if you offer me a free trip to the moon, but at the end of the day the fine print reads that I'm not coming back, I don't know how much I want to participate. So with that, I'll say that there is diminishing returns to dialing up light and desire. Alignment of vision and desire. I think this is just fundamentally important. When I think of the alignment of vision and desire, it is one of the things that you need to understand what your community wants. And also it's important to align your vision with the right community. Because if your vision of getting certain inputs does not meet the community that you're trying to reach out to, you're going to run and butt heads. And the reason why vision and desire is so important, especially in crowdsourcing, is because traditional means of structure are just not present. If I'm outsourcing somebody something, I'm paying them $1 for a return of something. So think of it like game mechanics. I want to get you to do something. How do I get you to do something? I talked to one of my childhood heroes last year. His name's Nolan Bushnell. You guys know Nolan Bushnell. He's the founder of Atari. He created games like Asteroids and Space Invaders and Pong. And as I was talking to him, I was just like, Nolan, how did you create these games? What was your inspiration? And he said to me, I was reading a book at the time. It was called Flow. Flow describes this feeling between humans where I feel sufficiently challenged, yet I can achieve objectives. And he said, in that theory, when I feel sufficiently challenged and I achieve objectives, I feel almost a state of, like, in a way, ecstasy. And I use that word because it's a very powerful, passionate word. It's this feeling that I want to do more. And he said that when someone's not sufficiently challenged, they get bored. When someone is too challenged, they get frustrated. So he said, when I want to create a game like Pong, I want to create a video game that someone can learn with a single quarter, but it would be impossible to master. I think that game mechanic we can use a lot in something like crowdsourcing. So now that we've talked about what crowdsourcing is, what crowdsourcing isn't, ways to stress test, now we get to the meat of the conversation, and we're going to close on this. Analyzing crowdsourcing is right for your project. I have two things to think about. The first is, do your outputs blend well to digital sharing? You've got this idea, you're ready to rock and roll, you're about to put it out the door. Question then becomes, is it good to share? Things like photos, videos, music, software. Those things can be scaled in a digital world almost instantaneously. And that helps drive that cycle of innovation forward. Remember, we want to get the collective wisdom of people rather than individual contributions. So the more that we can scale our outputs, the easier it is to tap into that collective wisdom. The next one is we want to think about how listening mechanisms are in place. Two-way communication is one of the most important things in crowdsourcing. And I say this just because we want to be in constant communication with our crowd. If we don't know what they're thinking, how they're thinking, then how do we know what's good or bad? Especially if we want to solicit feedback. Someone comes up with a crowdsourced idea, they may be going 1 to 2 degrees off of where you want them to be. By soliciting feedback, you get them snapped back to center. It's super important to have this kind of conversation with you. This two-way communication is super important. In fact, you start to ask yourself, what are my listening mechanisms? And do I have a community to engage with? What's my relationship with the community? Do I know what they're thinking before they do? These are all super important because there's an individual that may be yourself if you're doing a smaller project. It could be somebody in your company. It could even be a third party. But they're called your community managers. They are your face out in the real world. And they're so important because at the end of the day, they're the ones that are talking with your community. So you're asking yourself, what am I arming them with in order to achieve the objectives that I need to achieve? At the end of the day, if you can't say whether or not you have good listening mechanisms in place, and you're ready to go do a crowdsource project, I just recommend you double dip on this one. Really just double dip. And the reason why is you're going to end up hurting cats if you don't really think about how am I talking to my community, how are they talking back to me. And it could be as simple as saying, hey, I'm going to open up a Twitter account, I'm going to do a Facebook account, I'm going to do a Tumblr, a blog page, I'm going to open a 1-800 number. Some way that my community can reach out to me and then I can provide feedback. So as we wrap up, remember, if you think about stress testing, did you ask the right questions? Be original as it relates to you, your company, and what you're trying to accomplish. And then, is your vision and their desire aligned? And then lastly is, if you're ready to go, do your outputs lend well to digital sharing? And finally, do you have listening mechanisms in place? All questions that you're going to want to ask. Crowdsourcing is an incredible way to save money. It's a great marketing tool. And at the end of the day, don't be afraid to take risks and do something, because crowdsourcing is amazing. And I'll tell you, nobody who ever played it safe made history. Thanks, guys. I really appreciate your time.